This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 123 of Here's How for the 22nd of July 2021. If you had to choose between jail and giving the Gardaí the password to all your online accounts, would you choose Mountjoy or Wheatfield? Let's talk to an academic to weigh up your options.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
In a few minutes we'll have this.
If the Gardaí were using it to gain access to sensitive information that isn't yours, that could be unlawful.
But it's on your device, and are we expecting them just to cross their heart and hope to die and to not look at that?
Well, you're getting into tricky territory here about what the Gardaí may come across, what they may access, and what they could use against you.
That's coming up shortly. But first, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon, especially Dragos Staichu, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who does that. If you don't know, Patreon is basically a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 or €1 or $2 per podcast or per month. And that helps me to do more research and find interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as Dragos or the other donors, there's details on the website and at the end of this show. So then this happened.
AA Ireland is to discontinue its Roadwatch traffic and travel reports after almost 32 years of broadcasting on radio.
And with no notice at all, in the space of a single day, AA Roadwatch disappeared off our airwaves.
AA Roadwatch launched the careers of a number of broadcasters and presenters.
Latest travel news from the AA. It's a dry start to the day on the roads across the country this morning.
After almost 32 years, AA Ireland is to drop the mic on its traffic and travel reports. From tomorrow, it will no longer provide a...
According to their own announcement, this was a decision made by the AA which, quote, decided to move away from this service and instead focus on growing other areas of their business. That's corporate speak for closing down an unprofitable business. I had quite a few people get in touch with me about this, mostly wondering whether I had something to do with it. If you're not familiar with my history on this, it's pretty long running, but in brief, the AA is a registered political lobbyist. It's their job to persuade people, in particular politicians, to be more favourable towards the motor industry. In short, build more roads and less public transport. They seem to have been pretty successful. In the last few decades, while most of Europe developed sophisticated public transport, Ireland earmarked billions for motorways, often to places like Limerick and Westport, that couldn't remotely generate the amount of traffic that would justify the scale of the projects. Public transport in Ireland is pathetic compared to most continental countries. The only major project in the last 30 years has been the Luas, and even this was ferociously resisted by the AA's lobbying. They were central to the decision to punch the heart out of the system and make sure that the two lines didn't initially connect, a decision that cost the taxpayer hundreds of millions of euro and commuters a decade of inconvenience. The AA used AA Roadwatch to, day in, day out, beat the drum that the only significance of the Luas was how it caused traffic congestion. I took several complaints that all basically said that political lobbyists aren't allowed to supply content for broadcast on RTE, and RTE used every trick in the book to defeat those complaints. Then, one Friday morning in July, the AA said that the slots were axed. It was obviously a pretty hurried decision. The staff didn't even finish their day's work. AA Roadwatch was broadcast normally on Friday morning. The announcement was made that day, and the whole thing was shut down so fast that they didn't even do the drive time slots on Friday afternoon. The South Dublin accents, the expose, the reporting of a new bus corridor as though it was the siege of Mafeking, all the jokes about pronunciation of a car crash at a roundabout. I'm not going to do the accent. I'm no good at that. I'm not Mario. The loose horses, the traffic jams caused by Lewis Works, it was all gone. A cultural phenomenon just disappeared. But that wasn't even the strangest part of it. The reasons given by the AA to axe the slot were A, that they wanted to, as they put it, focus on other areas of business, basically save money, and B, because technology has moved on and people have smartphones that give traffic information that they can actually use, making AA Roadwatch even more useless than it already was. These seem like nonsense to me. Firstly, the point about traffic on smartphones, that's been true for the best part of a decade. It doesn't really ring true that AA management only heard of smartphones last Friday week. But the really strange one is that this is a cost-cutting measure. AA Roadwatch was insanely good value for the AA. Now, it's true that my complaints did have some effect. My complaints were rejected, but the bulletins normally ended with giving out the AA's phone number and web address, supposedly to report traffic, but coincidentally, both the phone line and the website were overwhelmingly used to sell the AA's insurance. On the same day that RT wrote their defence to the Broadcasting Authority, that call to action was dropped from the format. Despite that, have a listen to what Dr. Michael Foley, the Professor Emeritus at the School of Media at TU Dublin, and also a member of the NUJ's Ethics Council, said on the podcast in February 2019.
I admit that I hadn't thought about it till I heard your piece. I think it has become an incredible brand because of the AA, because of AA Roadwatch.
So that's what the AA got. But what did it cost them? The AA was produced by 7 part-time staff. Their typical researcher was a recent PR graduate. None of them had any qualifications in transport or any related field. Even if you're doing it rich and paying 50 grand a full-time equivalent, that would work out at less than 200 grand in staff costs. And let's be really generous and assume the same again for non-salary costs. You get up to maybe 400 grand. That's the annual cost of producing the 12,000 slots that went out on all RTE stations, plus Today FM and a couple of locals. Even if you forget about the other stations and just consider the RTE slots, that works out at €33 each. Contrast that with the cost of a 30-second ad on Morning Ireland. That would set you back anything up to €2,500 or more. Advertising rates change according to the time of day and the time of year, but considering that most of these Roadwatch slots were in prime time, and they were 90 seconds long, buying that much advertising would easily set you back €50 million a year. To be fair, I did put a little dent in the commercial value of them, and the branding value is priceless, but let's not call those slots real ads. In fact, let's be really generous and discount their value by 80%. That still leaves the AA getting €10 million worth of advertising for less than 400,000 in production costs. So the reasoning that this is a cost-saving measure just doesn't wash. Another thing, the AA said that they would be keeping up the traffic reporting service, just not on the radio. That promise didn't last long. The AA Roadwatch Twitter account averaged about 40 tweets a day on traffic reports. It basically went dark the moment that the announcement was made. So the answer is the best that I have is guesses. Maybe RTE realised that, notwithstanding their win against me at the BAI, the whole thing was legally unsustainable and closed it down a decent interval after declaring victory. Maybe it's not unrelated that we happen to have a Green Party Minister for Communications. Maybe it was something else.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line, I have Cian O'Crohor. He is Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at the Department of Law in NUI Maynooth. And he's been writing about the heads of bill, which are before the Dáil at the moment, of a bill called the Garda Síochána Powers Bill. Briefly, Cian, what is that bill supposed to do?
Thank you, William. Yeah, so it's a kind of an omnibus reform piece of legislation that is brought about because of two kind of recommendations that have come to the government. One was from the Commission on the Future Policing, which has recommended a lot of the changes that are incorporated in this. And also the Law Reform Commission has made some recommendations on how we should change certain powers that An Garda Síochána have and some of the processes that govern those powers. So the main areas of reform are really the ones that have interested people and have been written about quite a lot over the past few weeks. This is a very significant reform of the powers of Garda, powers of arrest and detention, and bringing it all together. So currently it's under the Garda powers are kind of spread across a number of different pieces of legislation. This is going to bring it all within one clear piece of legislation. Some of the existing legislation.
That's something for the nerdy lawyers to have all the legislation clarified and so forth from a legal point of view. But from a real person's point of view, what actual changes are likely to be made?
Yeah, so there's a very significant extension. Well, I mean, I should say that when you get these rationalizations, it's good for the citizens as well, in theory, because it's easier for you to see as a citizen, well, what are the Garda powers, where you can find in one piece of legislation what the Garda powers are, and the language has been changed. But one of the most significant changes that people have been particularly worried about is the Garda are going to be given a new power where they can compel an individual to give them their password for an electronic device. Now, Gardaí can only compel this when they're using it, they're working under a search warrant. So this is, the district court has given the Gardaí a search warrant to go and search your house. They pick up one of your electronic devices like your iPhone, and they want to access it because they want to get information from it. And at that moment, they can say to you please give us the password. And if you don't do that, you may be committing a criminal offence.
Okay, pause on that because there's a couple of things that jump out at me straight away. The first is that you're recommended not to do it, but I know that people do it, which is to reuse passwords. So if you're giving somebody your password for the electronic device, it's possible also that you're giving them your password perhaps for your online banking, you're perhaps giving them your password for social media sites, you're perhaps giving them a password for a whole slew of maybe very sensitive sites, dating sites or whatever might be, some people might view as very sensitive, and indeed other things that people regard as very private. Is that taken into account at all?
That's a really good question. I don't think it has been taken into account. I think the response of the government would probably be, well, look, once the Gardaí are operating within the remit of what the search warrant was granted, then that's all they're concerned about. If the Gardaí go beyond that, they're engaging in unlawful action themselves. So if they're accessing, unless the warrant includes, gives the Gardaí power to go and search for financial records and things like that. And they often do, part of a Garda search would be that they can rifle through, your bank statements if they're on your premises. So it wouldn't be beyond the bounds of possibility that if they're on your premises and they're accessing your computer.
But that's not a correct analogy, Cian, because this is more like they get a search warrant for your premises and that allows them to show up at the bank and get all of your bank records.
Well, I mean, it depends what is on your bank. So most of the time, what's on your bank statement is the same thing you would get on your online banking.
Most of the time, perhaps, but you'd have to agree that once you have the password for online accounts that people have, which may well be a password for a whole slew of different and unrelated things, that is likely to contain vastly more sensitive information than might just be stored in paper at somebody's premises.
Absolutely, and we can maybe agree to disagree about what the extent of the access might be on a bank, an online banking form. But I think if your point is around other kinds of social media sites that you might be engaged in, yes, it would give them extensive access, and they may be looking for that. Part of their search warrant, depending on the nature of the offence that they're investigating, the Gardaí may wish to access your social media accounts to find out what messages you've been sending. Like it's pretty standard. It has been pretty standard for the past number of decades with mobile phones, that when the Gardaí executing a search, that they would try and get access to your phone to see who've been calling, ask you questions about who you've been calling, check those numbers against other databases. So this is definitely an enhancement of their capacity to do that. If they can compel you to give over, if they can legally compel you to hand over passwords. But again, it wouldn't be necessarily beyond the bounds of like normal investigatory powers. This just makes it a bit more easy.
It's likely also that a great many people behind that, so that one password that maybe unlocks your phone, as it usually is, could well give somebody access to it, perhaps not the same password, but just that there are embedded passwords in that, for example, allow you to get onto your employer's network and have a whole host of sensitive commercial information
Well,
via
that may
that.
be unlawful. That may be unlawful. So if the Gardaí were using it to gain access to, sensitive information that isn't yours, that could be unlawful.
So, but it's on your device, and are we expecting them just to cross their heart and hope to die and to not look at that?
Well, you're getting into tricky territory here about what the Gardaí may come across, what they may access, and what they could use against you in a criminal prosecution. So if they're search, and this isn't unusual, that the bounds of Garda search, that it exceeds their lawful boundaries, whether that's constitutional lawful boundaries, that isn't uncommon. For a variety of reasons this happens. Now, what probably matters most to the vast majority of people is whether that can be used against you, whether the Gardaí would be entitled to bring any information they found as a result of that unlawful search into a court as evidence to be used as a prosecution.
That's a whole different story, because Gardaí, of course, can use the information that they find for a whole slew of other purposes other than bringing it into a court as evidence. I'll come back to that in a little bit, and that's worrying enough, I think, for a lot of people. But you were writing particularly about how this might impact journalists. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so as I explained to you before we started recording, I've had an interest. So this isn't necessarily my core area of research interest, but I have developed an interest in journalistic privilege in Ireland, the legal recognition of a thing called journalistic privilege that's been developing over the past 12, 13 years or so. It began in a Supreme Court case back in 2009, where the Irish Times was sued by the Mahon Tribunal because their documents were leaked to them, and they claimed privilege over that, and the Supreme Court eventually recognized that. Now, the nature of what that means, what journalistic privilege means, has still been contested. From journalists' perspective, they think, right, when we claim privilege over any information because we want to protect our sources and their identities, that means we can refuse outright to engage with any court demands. And now the court's view is, well, we may recognize something that looks a bit like journalistic privilege, but ultimately the courts get to decide. And the problem with the current legislation that governs warrants that the Gardaí can use, that governs the granting of warrants to Gardaí to search your premises, and this is continued in the new bill, is that it doesn't allow that court who gives the Gardaí that warrant, when they're making that decision about whether to grant Gardaí that warrant, it doesn't allow that court to take into consideration, well, look, the Gardaí are looking to search a journalist's premises here. Maybe they may have an interest in protecting their sources. Maybe we shouldn't grant this warrant because we want to respect their constitution, and it is a constitutional right, and their European Convention on Human Rights to protect their confidential sources. As it currently stands, there is no way, the Gardaí are automatically often granted these warrants, and they can come in and they can seize journalistic material. And currently, if it's in a password protected device, at least the journalist can refuse to give that password to the Garda, and then maybe they can institute proceedings in a higher court, probably the High Court, to try and stop this, to get the Gardaí to hand back any information they may have that might identify their sources. But the current the proposed legislation, particularly around the area of passwords, compelling people to give passwords, that could really compromise even that narrow bit of protection journalists currently.
Do I understand it correctly that what you're saying, the problem here is that it might be the case that if the Gardaí got hold of a password-protected device belonging to a journalist, the journalist could then go to court and say, well, I'm a journalist and this has information about confidential sources on it.
Yeah.
And the court might rule in their favour, but it might not, and might isn't good enough. Journalists want to have the certainty that they can say to their sources, you will not be exposed as a source. Not that they don't want to be able to say to a source, well, I'll promise to go to court and I might or might not win to keep you secret.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's absolutely the position of journalists around the world when it comes to this question. Their view is that the privilege, and they call it a privilege, and there's a reason they call it a privilege, which I can explain in a minute. Courts don't call it privilege because privilege has a very distinct meaning in our legal system. Privilege is normally like what are privileged disclosures or communications are usually between lawyers and their clients, and none of that can ever be compelled in a court. Privilege
has a legal meaning. That's to say, if I go to my lawyer, nobody can. There isn't. It's not the case that my lawyer can say can go before a court and say, please don't force me to tell to say what my client told me. The lawyer can basically thumb their nose and say, you have no power to do that. It's not based on a court decision that might go this way or that way. It is an absolute. And journalists like to call this a privilege, even though it doesn't have that status in law. It's let's say an opportunity that they have to do that.
Yeah, so I think the reason they call it a privilege is because, as far as they're concerned, they're ethically bound. Apologies now, I keep getting notifications, so I'll turn that off. So the problem is journalists want it. They from their perspective, as I understand it, ethically they feel like it doesn't matter what the court's view is on whether or not the court's what the court's view is on the status of that privilege. Journalists feel they're always ethically bound to protect their sources. So regardless of what the court's view is, they're going to do that. And it's this becomes a dispute, really. It's beyond the legal realm because the Irish court's attitude isn't unusual. Mm-hmm. This is a common, even in the United States.
So this is a tension between journalists and the legal system that is not fully resolved.
Yeah, and I one way to think about it. So if you look at the US, where most people would say journalists enjoy incredible protections under the Constitution, even there the courts have been very hostile to claims of journalistic privilege, and they've put journalists in prison on contempt of court for refusing to disclose their sources. And the difference here, the way to think about it is, normally the courts in advanced liberal democracies, if it's the state in terms of the executive, that's the government, or the legislature, or someone else, if they're trying to compel journalists to do something, then the courts are maybe more sympathetic. But when it's the courts who want the information for themselves, when they want a question answered and they feel like the journalist can help it, the courts are unsympathetic to journalist claims of looking for an enhanced privilege protection under the Constitution.
Do they have a point? If a bank manager, for example, was ordered to hand over financial records, he doesn't start beating his chest and going on prime time or whatever and talking about banking ethics, whatever that might be. Why are journalists so special? There's lots of people. There's lots of people who rely on confidentiality, and all of them are amenable to the courts. Why are journalists saying that they should be beyond the law?
Yeah, so this is the reason courts have, maybe they've not recognized the full privilege, but courts have granted, at least in this part of the world, they've granted some protections for confidentiality for journalists specifically and other publishers, is because in our Constitution, in the European Convention on Human Rights, and in the US Constitution, a lot of these legal documents, they say journalists are special, news media are special, they're really important for guaranteeing the health of our democracies. They're an important transparency and accountability to it. And while it might not say all that in the text of the Constitution, it's a really common theme that constitutional courts around the world have interpreted these freedom of expression clauses. There are freedom of expression guarantees in these various documents. They've interpreted them to mean that journalists are really important. The free flow of information is really important because it allows for, voters, the ordinary citizens, to see what's happening in the corridors of power. And that's what, it's a corollary of this freedom of expression guarantee that gives journalists this other that journalists claim, and the courts have agreed, gives journalists this other protection, this confidentiality protection, because journalists, in order
so
to
are they essentially saying, well, freedom of speech is so important, therefore journalists who are important to freedom of speech should have, by virtue of us saying freedom of speech is important, we also read into that a special right which says that journalists should get special treatment compared to the bank manager or whatever, anybody who might say that their business also depends on confidentiality.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's fundamentally is who is more important for the health of a democracy? Is a banker more healthy? No. I mean, and textually in the Constitution, the text of our Constitution and other documents, it says freedom of expression is really important for democracy, and journalists are a huge part of that. Not just journalists, other people as well. But when it comes to enhancing free flow of information, most people credit journalists with being kind of the main drivers, the main engine of encouraging the free flow of information.
Okay. I want to pause that. And obviously you're a law professor, and that has that gives you a particular perspective. But is it not possibly true that away from, I don't know if you have ivory towers in Maynooth, but away from the ivory towers, that this has an awfully different ring to it? And I'm thinking perhaps, for example, in 2017 with the journalist Dara Quigley, she was mentally ill and she was videoed by Garda surveillance video naked and in very considerable distress. Members of the Gardaí then back at the control centre where they have these screens, videoed the screen, just literally pointed their phone at a video screen displaying this, shared that on WhatsApp, that was shared on social media and was viewed more than 100,000 times. 5 days later, Dara Quigley committed suicide. And that, it seems to me, to be clearly a very serious event. But it seems to be more typical of how things go in the Garda Síochána, in that these very legalistic rules perhaps are implemented when a case is being built for court. But most of what the Gardaí do doesn't end up in court. And Ireland is a small country of small towns. The likelihood is that this is going to be massively abused. What happens where a Garda comes across someone who is, for example, going out with his ex and thinks there might be, for example, intimate photos of her or him on a phone? This is the sort of thing that's going to crop up and going to cause huge problems, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's important to differentiate the capacity of the law to regulate behavior and also, our need to empower. So there's two things going on here. Depends on what you view these legal regimes as doing. Are they constraining police power, or are they providing or expanding police power? And there's an ongoing tension about what this is doing.
Pause, before you continue, just a yes or no question. Are you aware of, or do you know, when the last bill went through the Dáil which reduced Garda powers?
I don't believe there has been any reduction on Garda powers
ever.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean,
I think you're correct. In the history of the state, every single, and we've had many, many of them, every single bill on this subject has reduced citizens' rights and increased Garda powers, hasn't it?
I can't tell you for certain, but I would not be surprised if that was the case.
Okay, but continue then, and I interrupted you. Continue on this, because the reality is that the Gardaí are not a well-behaved force. And we've seen recently, and we mentioned it briefly recently on this podcast, about the scandal over cancelling 999 calls. And to my mind, the root scandal there was not the actual cancelling, although that was extremely serious. What's really serious there is that none of those Gardaí have been disciplined in any way. They're still on the same job that they were failing terribly on. And the senior Gardaí who protected those, you could perhaps, if you were generous, say incompetent or perhaps corrupt Gardaí, the same senior Gardaí who were protecting those Gardaí and refusing to hand over information to the policing authority also have not been removed. In any normal democracy, all of them would be sacked on the spot, wouldn't they?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think that's the case. If you look at a lot of other jurisdictions that have dealt with policing scandals, the exact same patterns have fallen out. These are extraordinarily complex. The scandals, the nature of the wrongdoing, potential wrongdoing is extraordinarily complex, and it can take ages to figure out what exactly was going wrong.
But where Senior Gardaí refused to hand over information that would assist the inquiry into serious malpractice,
yeah,
that's incredibly serious, and there is not even any discussion in the public domain as to how those Senior Gardaí who are protecting corrupt / incompetent more junior Gardaí, there's not even any discussion about disciplining them.
Yeah, so there's a number of different things going on here, and I definitely do not want to be seen as a defender of An Garda Síochána, but I do have experience of policing scandals in other jurisdictions. So An Garda Síochána, by comparison with other police forces in this part of the world, are more secretive and less inclined to be towards transparency, operational transparency, than other police forces. You can look into our neighbouring jurisdictions in England and Wales, and sometimes maybe Scotland to a certain extent. And generally, a lot of those police forces in those jurisdictions are much more comfortable being transparent. But you do still have the exact same scandals. And very recently, the Metropolitan Police in London, who've gone through decades of very significant reform, they're caught in this exact same trap of institutional defensiveness around perceived potential threats.
Roll back there. I want the listeners to catch exactly what you said. You said after they've gone through decades of reform, which is not what has happened to the Gardaí, they still have very, very problematic behaviour. Well,
there has been. There has been fairly significant reform of An Garda Síochána in terms of the governance architecture. We've had since 2005. We've had very significant. Now it's flawed. I don't think anyone would argue that the reforms that were brought in after the Morris Tribunal in 2005 have been a really spectacular success. But this takes...
Well, you mentioned the Morris Tribunal. One particular Garda who wasn't charged or suspected with corruption in that was questioned as to why he didn't report corruption that he had witnessed. And he said, you don't hang your own. Do you think... And as I understand it, that Garda, who was clearly in dereliction of his duty, is still employed by the Gardaí. That is shocking, isn't it?
It's absolutely shocking, but it is very, very common in police forces for what's called blue wall of silence or the blue code of silence. It's not unusual even in other major, the cultural dynamics in police forces definitely tend themselves towards institutional closure and defensiveness and secrecy. Some forces have made a lot of effort. I think there are complex reasons why An Garda Síochána has been very, very slow to reform as an organisation.
We're way behind the curve, given the developed nation of where we are as a nation in terms of development. We are way behind the curve, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think An Garda Síochána, as public sector institutions go, is probably significantly behind any other public sector institution in terms of organisational change and reform. Part of that is rooted in government failure. The government really didn't want to know about police reform until they were dragged kicking and screaming by the Morris Tribunal partially, but they were able to fob that off as a few rotten apples. Because it was confined to a particular geographic location
in Donegal,
and it took years to get through the tribunal. And even though Judge Morris did really remarkable work in identifying serious cultural problems within the organisation, it was very, very hard. And to be honest with you, the Irish public just wasn't willing to accept, nor are they willing to accept now that there's any serious problems. If you look at trust and confidence data with An Garda Síochána, it's probably without peer the most trusted police force in Europe. Now, there are the reasons for that are very, very complicated. Why people feel they can trust a police force, but that fact of that very high level of trust and confidence that they routinely publish makes it very, very difficult for a government to start coming in and saying, there are serious problems here, because their voters are saying that they trust the police force. And while it's absolutely correct to say, and we can say, there is serious problems and we've been attempting reform, it's very difficult to get political momentum behind reform. We saw that with the Disclosures Tribunal. The government really, really resisted until the very end because they just didn't want to know. It was seen as politically toxic to try and engage in this, and not advantageous electorally either. And what's happened is, what is unusual about the Irish reforms, and there are problems with the most recent round of reforms that came in after the Disclosures Tribunal. Now we're going to have our third new governance architecture following the Commission on the Future of Policing.
What's that in plain English? What's the third new governance?
So we currently have the Policing Authority, which was set up as a direct response to the controversies. And the idea behind the Policing Authority is to remove politics from governance of policing. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to have a new system that's replacing the Policing Authority and the Garda Síochána Inspectorate, which was set up in 2005, and the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission. So the Commission on the Future of Policing has recommended some changes, fairly significant changes to that. But all of this, what's different about Ireland, and I think it tells you a lot about the politics of it, of how the politics has played out in policing and criminal justice, is we've completely removed politics from the governance. Because if you look in other jurisdictions, it tends to be politicians who are involved in these.
It's the reverse of what has happened in the north.
Yeah, absolutely. In Northern Ireland, the policing board is populated almost exclusively by politicians from the Assembly. So it's a highly politicised governance system in the north of Ireland. And what we've done down here, which is interesting, and I think there are good reasons for doing it, because, to be honest, in the north there was a big political appetite for very significant policing reform, obviously coming from one side, from the nationalist and Republican communities, but there was an appetite there. There's no appetite here.
Okay, pause on that, because I'm interested in that. And as for the trust surveys, I don't want to get into it. I don't think we have time in this interview, but I would perhaps question those. But I just want to go back to one incident that I think happened about 10 years ago, when Luke Ming Flanagan was a new TD in Leinster House. And anybody who's been there will know that Leinster House in the Dáil buildings, access to that is really quite tightly controlled. You don't normally get let in unless you're being accompanied by someone and you have an invitation and so forth. But he had a senior member of the Gardaí just kind of knock on his door, of his immediate office, and say, oh yeah, and give him some words of congratulations, and then going away said, oh yeah, you had some penalty points there, we looked after that. That, to me, and at the time, as he admitted himself, he accepted that and did nothing about it. And it was the penalty point scandal came out later. But that, to me, speaks to a very insidious behaviour of soft corruption. That is a serious thing that's happening there, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
That wasn't a coincidence. That wasn't a coincidence that Garda had, a senior Garda, by the way, had that information, had it at his disposal at that time, and not only being aware of the penalty points, but had them, as he put it, sorted out. Yeah,
absolutely. No, I mean, and it is. I think and that was the origin story, really. The penalty points, as you recall, was the origin story for what became the Disclosures Tribunal. I mean, it's soft corruption that evolved because of the controversies around it. It evolved into very, very serious corruption by the most senior police officer in the state. Mm-hmm. Corrupt, abusive power behavior, whatever you want to call it. But to draw back to the question, kind of your line.
It was 2007, that incident, by the way. But in any case, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, but the penalty point scandal that evolved in kind of 2011, 2012, it was from cancelling of penalty points from
correct,
the
yes.
Yeah. So the story only crystallized a few years later, but that is the origin story. And absolutely, I don't think there's any doubt that that kind of soft corruption was pervasive. I'm not confident it's still like that, to be honest, because that was 2007. There has been fairly significant change, just even in personnel in Garda Síochána. There has been a changing out of some of the older officers who would have had particular views on how you do policing, particularly outdated views on how you might do policing. And that's a slow process. And the lesson I probably should emphasize here is, if your question is, how do we resolve this? Your line of questioning is kind of suggesting, well, we don't want to give these people too many powers. Maybe we should be retrenching Garda powers to teach them a lesson. And changing police culture is not achievable by legal changes, one way or the other. It takes a lot more of an invested, concentrated, patient effort. It takes years to change these organizations because you're dealing with thousands and thousands of people who have been acculturated in a particular way. And I mean, it isn't talked about. I would have concerns about what was happening in Templemore over the decades and the attitude to Garda training, but also just, hiring standards, promotion standards, which has come up quite a lot. The problems in the organization are extraordinarily deep, but they won't be resolved by simple legislative changes one way or the other. And what's coming against that is it like our complex crimes, basically, is the way to describe it. Increasingly complex crime that police forces, including on Garda Síochána, are expected. And this is the other side of the story, is, we've been focused on police wrongdoing. On Garda Síochána, despite its failures, often does extraordinarily good work in terms of holding very serious wrongdoers to account. But a lot of the kinds of wrongs that we're more interested in now, particularly in the area of sexual violence, and child abuse investigation, that requires a degree of intervention, immediate state intervention. The public expect interventions a lot earlier, and that does require, enhancing to some degree police power. So that's what's pushing against it here.
Cianna Crothúr, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at the Department of Law in NUI Maynooth, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Record a contribution to be included in the next show. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Cianna Crothúr at Cianna Crothúr, the spelling is on the website. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. Also, thanks again to Dragos and to all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate €1 or $2 per podcast or per month, please do go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.